Hello and welcome to Cine 104, class number 6. And we're getting into a pretty interesting time here in American and world film history. And it's a very exciting time into the 1960s, the late 1960s, and early 1970s. A lot's going on in the world, and all of that is going to affect what's going on in the film industry. So let's look at the influences of the social influences that are going to influence the way movies are made and what kind of movies are going to be made. First up, the Vietnam War. Very big deal on college campuses in the mid 1960s and early 1970s because there is a draft. And that means that even if you don't want to serve in the military, you can be drafted. The government decided that there weren't enough volunteers into the armed forces to fight the war in Vietnam, and the military convinced them that unless there was a draft, we wouldn't be able to wage the war the way they wanted to wage that particular war. So there was a draft. All young men of draft age, which is 18, and you'd and up. But on your 18th birthday, you would register for the draft, and you would get at a certain point during the year, you would get a draft number. And what that means is it would be random. They would take all of the days of the year, January 1st through December 31st, and put them on ping pong balls and put them in a big drum that they could rotate. And then on another separate drum, they would put number 1 through number 365 on another set of ping pong balls in another drum, and randomly somebody would pull out a day of the year, like August 28, and then a draft number, which would be 37. And so anybody born on August 28th, 18 years prior, like I was, would have a draft number of 37. So what does a draft number of 37 mean? Well, it means that unless you had a deferment, you would probably get called up. About the first 100 or so, at one point maybe up to 110 or 120 of those numbers, if you were born on that day corresponding to that draft number, you could get called up, and then the military would have enough people to serve in the armed forces. So you wanted a high draft number. And if you didn't have a high draft number, then there were a couple of ways that you could still stay out of the draft or stay out of the war. People in the police departments wouldn't get called up. People in ministry wouldn't get called up. And there were physical deferments. If you had if you're too tall or too short or too fat or too thin, and they had corresponding weights and heights and all that kind of stuff. I would suspect that if you had diabetes and things like that, that you would be deferred. Also, back then, you would be deferred if you were homosexual. That wasn't the sort of thing that you would want to pretend to be, even if you didn't want to go to Vietnam. There was really a lot of stigma. Sadly, there was quite a stigma against gay people, gay men back then. And if you got out of serving in Vietnam because you were gay, then you were going to have a kind of a rough go of it in society in general, possibly having a hard time finding work and things like that. So unless you were really legitimately gay or homosexual, you really didn't want to pretend to be so. The most popular one is or was a student deferment. And so you could be deferred from the draft if you were a full-time student. So you had to be a full-time student. You couldn't just take one class or something like that. You had to be full-time and take 4 classes. And you only had that deferment for 4 years, so you had to pass all your classes for 4 years. You couldn't extend it out any further than that. So that partly that's how I got through college in 4 straight years. I went a couple of summers. I took a class each summer and managed to be deferred during the length of the latter part of the war. And then I was so close that I finished my senior year in college and got my bachelor's degree. So that was a big deal on college campuses. So a lot of the anti-war marches, protests, all that kind of stuff would be taking place on college campuses. And a lot of these social influences on late 60s and early 70s American films related to young people. So the war, right off the bat, 18 years old, and then you could be serving. You could always volunteer, of course, as well. If you didn't want to go into the Army and you thought maybe you'd rather be in the Air Force or the Navy, then you'd have to volunteer, and you'd be in for 4 years rather than 2 years. So that's the first social influence. Number two would be really just youth culture. Rock and roll music. Woodstock happened in 1969, and rock music was a little bit divisive. A lot of the music, maybe the sort of thing by Steppenwolf or Jimi Hendrix or Led Zeppelin, would be meant to be played kind of loud. It wasn't the sort of thing that a lot of parents liked. They certainly liked, pop music and that sort of thing. But the rock music was kind of divisive. It really was, and certainly there were protest songs, things like that. People, Bob Dylan and people like that, and writing protest songs and so on. A big social influence. Also with young people, with their draft and their music would be recreational drugs, marijuana, LSD, and that sort of thing came out of the Southwest, came out of possibly the ghetto, and emerged on college campuses. So that would be one of the first places where people started experimenting. Marijuana had been around for quite a while, certainly. Like I mentioned, in the Southwest and Mexico and places like that. In the 1950s, jazz musicians and people like that quite possibly would be experimenting. And these drugs were hallucinogens and thought to expand your mind. It wasn't just like getting bombed or zonked or drunk or whatever. It was more of a spiritual, mind-expanding sort of a thing. At least that was the idea among the very early users, Timothy Leary and people like that. Of course, it quickly got away from that and got to be just people wanting to get stoned rather than to somehow be creative and free their mind and go on a spiritual quest or whatever. But that's certainly something going on in this period. Also, fashion, and we start having longer hair on men, and that was kind of a political statement. If you had shoulder length hair like these guys here, it sort of was like a political statement that you also were anti-war and you also like to smoke pot and listen to rock music. They sort of all went hand in hand. They sort of all went together. And today, I see students in my classroom with long hair and shaved heads and everything in between, and hardly anybody looks at them a second time. But back then, long hair was kind of a statement, and in certain places in the country, especially in small towns and especially in the South, you really didn't want to get caught with long hair by the police if you were caught speeding or something like that. Some might just say, well, maybe they've got lice and we better shave their heads or something like that. So it was really kind of a thumb or the finger to authority and to society back then to have long hair. And for women, and beards too. And for women, mini skirts, not the traditional knee length or so skirts, but halfway up the thigh. Shorter and shorter miniskirts were starting to become in fashion. And believe it or not, pants. Women were in small towns and small schools like I grew up in. Luckily, I didn't grow up in the South, but I grew up in a small town in Michigan, small farm town, and rather conservative, even up there in the Middle West. And the girls in my class were not supposed to be wearing pants, slacks, jeans, whatever. They're supposed to be wearing skirts. And of course, that was a way that young women could sort of assert their stance on society and all that as well. By the way, one of those people in that photo is yours truly. I'll let you figure that out. Also, still from the 1950s, civil rights and voting rights. And it had been around for a while. Martin Luther King, right here, and his wife and other people. I think that's Ralph Abernathy. I can't name everybody off, but this might be the March on Selma or possibly in Washington, D.C. But the civil rights movement was still around. African Americans in the South were fighting for the right to register to vote, believe it or not. That's what the March on Selma was all about, to register black people to vote in Mississippi and Alabama and places like that in the South. And some college kids, freedom riders, they were called, rode buses down south to register blacks to vote, and some of them were killed for their efforts. 4 college students and many others beaten up, sometimes by police, down in the South. It was a dangerous thing to even register to vote. Blacks were told you need to recite the Constitution, or you need to recite the Declaration of Independence or something like that, ridiculous things that almost nobody could do in order to be able to register to vote. And churches, black churches in particular, were at the forefront of that movement. Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King, people like that. And so that was still going on, right? From the 1950s, still going on into the 1960s, and becoming more and more out there. And the response from some officials in the South in particular were more and more violent, with water hoses and dogs and things like that. So that was a big thing. You could see that on the evening news. If you turned on the evening news, you would see stories about the Vietnam War, and you might see stories about the latest civil rights activity, marches, protests, and things like that. All right there on the evening news. So if you were a writer or a director or an actor in America, especially in Hollywood, then you were going to see this stuff. You were going to see it possibly on the streets of LA and certainly on the evening news. And when this stuff is around, you are going to be affected by that. And you're going to think about what kinds of movies might appeal to people that are being involved in that sort of thing. Also, the women's equality movement. A little bit later, more into the 1970s, but there was an amendment to the Constitution that was being voted on, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and women were really fighting for equality of pay, equal pay for equal work, and more opportunities and things like that. A lot of people thought that it was a waste, not everybody, but too many people thought it was a waste to send women to college because they were just going to get married and they were going to waste all that time they spent in college. Some people joked that instead of working on a BA or an MBA or a PhD, a lot of young women were working on an MRS, which is to say, Mrs. Find a mate, find a guy from college and get married. So that was kind of the attitude that some people had back then. It wasn't really something for women to do. Today, women are more than 50% of college students. I think it's closing in on 60%. It would be very unusual to have a female doctor or lawyer back in the middle 1960s, early 1970s, and today it's got to be closing in on half. So big changes in those 50 years of what women can do, what kind of opportunities women could have. There were traditional women's jobs, aside from being a mother and to be in the home. You might see women as school teachers, secretaries, nurses, childcare, traditional women's activities, but certainly not doctors and lawyers and politicians and things like that. And so that has changed drastically for the good, I would say. But it was quite a different time back then. And again, going to influence 1970s American films. And finally, Watergate, the break-in and cover-up. And if you're a little bit hazy on the whole Watergate thing, the Watergate was a office complex and apartments, just a building in the Washington, D.C. area. And the Democratic National Committee had their offices there, and they were the ones that were, it was an election year in 1972, and George McGovern running against Richard Nixon, and the National Committee was there, and some people from the Republican side snuck in and were wiretapping the place. They were bugging the place and taking photos of some of the material that they found in filing cabinets and that sort of thing to get an edge on the campaign in that election, November of 1972. Has to be the stupidest crime ever, really. The people that got caught by just a lone night watchman were ex-CIA types and that sort of thing. And initially, the public was not very interested in it, but some intrepid reporters from the Washington Post and some other newspapers wouldn't let go. They wouldn't let go of the story and started, who is paying these people? Who is paying these people off? Follow the money was the word or the term. And eventually the money led to the top law enforcement officer in the country, the Attorney General, John Mitchell, and into the White House, which is the president's office. And the president really didn't need to do that at all. Nixon was running for re-election. His first run for the presidency in 1960 against Kennedy was a very, very, very close race. It might have somehow made sense to have inside information then. He ran for the presidency a second time in 1968 against Hubert Humphrey, and that was again a very, very, very close election, and any edge that you could get might have helped out. But in 1972, he was running for re-election. He was fairly popular, and finally sort of starting to wind the war down in Vietnam. The economy is doing okay, and Nixon won in a landslide. He won in a landslide, 48 states, I think, out of 50 in the Electoral College. So he didn't need any help. He didn't need any bugged offices or anything like that. It was just a really stupid, stupid mistake. And if you make a mistake, own up. But the cover-up usually is worse than the crime. If they had just owned up that, yeah, we know these people were breaking into the Democrats' thing, that's it. Maybe paid a fine, maybe short prison sentences for some of those low-level people, and it would have gone away. But they tried to cover it up, and the cover-up is what cost Nixon the presidency. It wasn't the crime, really. It was the cover-up that cost him the presidency. And again, all of this is going on, and people are, young people in particular, but lots of people are thinking that authority that are should be anti-authority, the people that are in charge, whether it's in the government or whether it's in schools or whether it's in churches or whether it's in sports, everything needs to maybe get rethought. it's not like a revolution, overthrow the government, but people are thinking that the people that are in authority aren't with the people in the country and need to maybe uh, rethink things. There's a new way of doing things and that sort of thing. So there was a big move, like I said, youthful rebellion, anti-authority, and that sort of thing. And that is going to run through the films that are going to be made in the late 60s and early 70s. So what kinds of films are going to be made during this period? First up, we have Blow Up, 1966, from Michelangelo Antonioni. He's Italian. This was his first English language film. It's set in the swinging 60s, swinging London of the 1960s. There's a fashion photographer, as we see right here, and I have a link to this clip. It's a pretty famous clip. And he is doing this job with rich people and high fashion and models and all that. And he wants to do something more than this commercial work. He wants to do something a little bit deeper and maybe take photos of working class people and something a little bit more artistic than fashion photography. And in the middle of all this, while shooting some pictures in a public park, he is developing those pictures, and he thinks he sees something off in the trees and the bushes and that sort of thing. So he blows up or enlarges some photos, and they get grainier. The more you blow them up, it gets much grainier, but he thinks he sees a gun and possibly a body and that sort of thing. And so there's a little bit of possibly a murder going on in the midst of this man's life. So a very interesting film, and I've got some nice clips linked to it. Roger Corman is also around. He was making movies, producing and directing and writing movies since the 1950s, and a big influence on young directors. He hired such future stars as Francis Coppola, who would go on to do The Godfather, Martin Scorsese, who's still working today, Goodfellas and Casino and all those movies, James Cameron, and Ron Howard. Okay, so lots of future Oscar winners, and even with actors like Jack Nicholson and Sylvester Stallone and Sandra Bullock. So he was kind of the king of schlock. But a lot of these young guys getting out of film school, this is the film school generation for the most part, are getting a chance to actually direct real movies, not student movies, but real movies. He's taking a chance and hiring these guys. It's sort of like grad school for these guys. And so he's kind of a big influence, right? There's influence from foreign films and foreign directors like Kurosawa and Fellini and Bergman and people like that. But also in America, a lot of these people are being influenced by guerrilla directors not getting shooting permits and things like that, and just go out there and shoot until somebody chases you away. So I've got a link to a fun Roger Corman movie. He's the kind of guy that made drive-in movies, and we've talked about drive-in movies. Black and white, cheap, take a couple of weeks to shoot some of these things, but it was a great training ground for these young up-and-coming directors and actors. So I've got Bucket of Blood, which is a comedy, believe it or not, and really a lot of fun. So there are 3 transition films. I call them transition films into the new Hollywood. They came out importantly, before the ratings system comes in. So before you can start having R-rated movies and that sort of thing. Some of these movies are being released without the code, the production code seal of approval, and rather violent. This movie has quite a famous ending where, spoiler alert something from 80 years ago, but spoiler alert, Bonnie and Clyde go down in a hail of gunfire. Literally, their car was shot up pretty good. I think I have a picture of their car coming up. And so sex and violence, and some theaters refused to show it. It certainly didn't pass the production code. And it came from a director from the live TV generation, Arthur Penn. Warren Beatty, the star and the producer, right there as Clyde, and there's Faye Dunaway over here as Bonnie. Really thought that he had something on his hands. He really thought this is kind of like a French New Wave film, and he really wanted one of the French New Wave directors, possibly one of the guys from Breathless or something like that. Jean-Luc Godard possibly to direct it, or Francois Truffaut, and he thought he had something pretty good there on his hands. The studio really didn't get it, and here's a picture of the real Bonnie and Clyde. Not bad looking, not quite as gorgeous as Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, but you know, they look okay. They look fine. It wasn't that much of a stretch, I guess. Anyway, studio's thinking drive-in, summer. It's just another schlock. It might as well be a Roger Corman movie. And Beatty is just hounding them. This is a much better movie. You got to book it into better theaters, and you know, not just drive-ins during the summer. And he got a very nice review from a very influential film critic. And today we don't have very influential film critics. We sort of have aggregations of critics from Rotten Tomatoes and things like that. But individual film critics don't have quite the power and authority that some of them did back in the 60s and 70s. And there was a critic, her name was Pauline Kael. She wrote for the New Yorker magazine, and she gave it a very favorable review, and Beatty took that review and showed it to the people at the studio, Jack Warner at Warner Brothers Studio. And Jack Warner, remember, he had been around since the 1930s and 1940s, so he's getting a little long in the tooth. He's not really connected to young people so much anymore. And he really needed to be convinced. And the Pauline Kael review kind of helped him out. So in the fall, they released it into some nice theaters, and kind of got the critics from around the country to check out this movie, and the Film Academy. And as a result, it got 8 Oscar nominations, and it won 2. And 8 Oscar nominations is a pretty good number for a drive-in movie, right? That's the kind of movie that they thought they had. Instead, it was really an Academy Award-winning sort of movie, and it really shows how out of touch the Hollywood studio moguls were at that time. Very interestingly, and it is shown in the movie, Bonnie, the real Bonnie Parker, and it's portrayed in the movie, she really loved media attention, and she took photos like this, right, with a cigar and a gun and that sort of thing, and the previous picture with Clyde, and they had a picture, they actually got the drop on a police officer and took his picture, and she would send these pictures to newspapers with poetry. And today, you can imagine she'd be all over social media, she'd be all over Twitter and Instagram and all that sort of thing. She really loved the media and the attention that it got her. And she's kind of stylish there. She's wearing a beret, and I imagine that's fairly stylish for the 1930s. They were wearing their dresses at mid-calf and so on. But, you know, she's got this sort of aggressive pose there. I love the cigar. I don't think she was a real cigar smoker. So very interesting with Bonnie. So that is the death car, as it's called, the Bonnie and Clyde death car. And it is still around. It is in Nevada at State Line or PIM, or what, not in Las Vegas, but it's there. They probably stole the car. Bonnie and Clyde probably stole the car, so its ownership has probably been in dispute. Possibly an enterprising police chief had it or sold it or some such thing, but it's been on public display probably ever since the shootout in the middle 1930s when they went down in that hail of gunfire, and you can see it all shot up. And the film, the Bonnie and Clyde film from 1967, showed that, but some people called it really almost like pornography, violent porn or something like that, because as they're dying, it's in slow motion, and it looks kind of nice. It's almost like balletic, right? It's almost like a ballet, the way the bodies are sort of being shot up in slow motion on the ground, and a lot of people had a lot of trouble with that. It was a very controversial movie, almost glorifying violence. And there were other movies that did the same thing. There's another pretty good movie called The Wild Bunch by Sam Peckinpah, and lots and lots of slow motion shootouts and things. It's a Western cowboy movie, and that was problematic for a lot of people, almost glorifying violence. Our next film of these few that are transitional is The Graduate from 1967, directed by Mike Nichols, who won an Oscar for directing the film. The film didn't win the Oscar. Dustin Hoffman there in a role that really made him a star as young Benjamin. And it is transitional in that there's really no long hair. Nobody has shoulder-length hair. There's nobody smoking pot. There's no talk of Vietnam, nothing like that. And if you're going to be talking about college students in the late 1960s, you'd think that that would be something that would be shown or talked about in the film. But it's based on a book that was written, I think, in 1959. And so it relates to that book in that it's not going to talk about current events, but it does have a real anti-authority feel. So it sort of feels like the 1960s, but it's not in-your-face 1960s. Like I say, with Benjamin home from college smoking pot in his bedroom or some such thing. It doesn't have anything like that. The whole shock is that Benjamin, a recent college graduate, is going to have an affair with a woman old enough to be his mother. And she is his parents' friend, the wife of Benjamin's father's partner. Okay, so that's Mrs. Robinson. And you might know the song from Simon and Garfunkel. And let's see, do I have it in? Yeah, so Ben is searching for a life of meaning, not just money. He looks like he lives in a pretty nice place. I don't know if it's Beverly Hills. They have a backyard swimming pool. It's quite a gorgeous house. So definitely upper middle class for sure. And Ben is he wants a little bit more out of life. As a recent college graduate, he just doesn't know what he wants to do. He went to a really good school back east. He won awards and things like that, and now he's a little bit lost. In the film, interestingly, all of the parents, what you might call grown-ups, are Mr. or Mrs. Okay, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Robinson, people like that, and Ben and Elaine, Mrs. Robinson's daughter, are only known by their first name. So it's sort of a way of making them a little bit more younger, like a kid, than a grown-up, even though he's a college graduate, 20, 21, something like that. And at his party, the first scene in the movie, the guests are all his parents' friends, and they're sort of tussling his hair like a little kid, like a little 8-year-old kid, that sort of thing. You'll notice they never listen to him. He says things, and nobody ever answers him or says anything about his questions and things. They don't hear him. It's almost like he's invisible. So there are a couple of interesting terms in the movie, and I have a link to this scene here, Plastic. It's a wonderful scene, and a man at the graduation party tells Ben, I have one word for you. I have one word for you out by the pool. Come with me. He takes him all alone out by the pool. You'll see it. And he says, plastic. And, what do you mean? And the man says, there's a great future in plastic. But to a lot of people in the late 1960s, a lot of young people, plastic had a second sort of a term to be fake and not real, not like wood or cotton or some real thing, but artificial and not real. So plastic people, that sort of thing. It was kind of derogatory. It wasn't widely used, but it's sort of a derogatory term for people, plastic. Also, Ben doesn't want to be a sellout. And again, it's not like all the tickets are gone, but to be a sellout in the 1960s and 1970s meant that you would take a job for the money or do something really just for the money and not for your political or your emotional or spiritual beliefs. And today, you could be a sellout, and it could be on either side, right? It could be on either side, but maybe you get somebody offers you a job to work for the tobacco industry, and you really think tobacco is not really the best thing, but you're going to take that job for the money, so you're a sellout. And you could do it from the left or from the right, liberal or conservative, but you're taking a job for the money and not something that you really and truly believe in. Maybe a political candidate from the other party, something like that. So that is to be a sellout. Hey, don't be a sellout, man. And that's the idea, right? Don't work for the man. Okay, you got to find your own way. But of course, as we well know, you got to pay the rent, you got to pay the mortgage, got to buy groceries, and you need to find a job. And sometimes you can't be too picky. If somebody's offering you a pretty sweet job to work for the other party or to work for the tobacco industry or the rifle association, and you might just have to take that job, and it's a hard thing to do. So in November 1968, the rating system replaces the 1934 production code, also known as the Hays Code, because the man who ran it for many years, not by 1968, but for many years was named Will Hays. We talked about this in maybe our first class. And so now we have the studios are self-censoring themselves. And just like in the 1930s, they didn't want to wait for the government to step in and say, you're making these movies like Bonnie and Clyde or The Graduate with this young kid having an affair with a woman old enough to be his mother, all that sort of thing. And so the studios are thinking, just like they did 35 years before that, if we don't do something about this, then the government or boycotts are going to step in and they're going to censor our movies for us. So it was self-censorship on their part, proactive before anything else could happen. And that's going to change a lot. That's going to make as much of a change in the kinds of movies that are seen as the influences from the Vietnam War or from rock music or fashion or long hair or marijuana or any of that kind of stuff. Because now with the rating system, it's a kind of a business decision, okay? If we have movies that people can't get into because they're too young, then we're limiting our own audience. Okay, so with the R-rated movies, you have to be 17 unless you have a parent or adult guardian. And in 1984, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. There we go. And here's the shaman, and he's got a beating heart right there in his hand. Pa-pump, pa-pump. And it was rated PG. There was no PG-13 yet. And parents with little kids, not parents with 16-year-old kids, but parents with 5-year-old or 6-year-old kids wanting to take them out to see a nice adventure movie like Indiana Jones, are shocked to see scenes like this going on in the movie. And some of the little kids are maybe crying, getting kind of traumatized, and writing. Now they're going to be writing letters. These parents writing letters to the studios saying, "I took my 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old child to see the new movie, and it was awful and gross and all that." Another movie came out about that same time called Gremlins, and yeah, they're little mechanical like doll things, but 6, 5, 6, 7-year-old kids, they don't get it. They think they're little things, little creatures, little, like a pet, a dog or a cat or something, little gremlins, and the gremlins are mean and bad, and fighting them off, they get shot, they get pushed into microwave ovens and down garbage disposals, and it looks pretty funny because adults know that they're little doll. They're not even CGI yet. They're little doll things. But again, parents are upset, kids are crying maybe, and so with those two movies, the Academy wisely added a mid-range between PG and R, and that's the PG-13. In 1990, No Children Under 17, NC-17, replaces X, and there had been quite a few changes over the years. Originally, it started with GP, then or G, and then GP, and then M for mature, and then X. So there was lots of tweaking. I don't want to give you the whole history of all this, but there was lots of tweaking. GP to be PG. M was confusing. Which is worse, M or R? So they changed M and so on to PG and R. X was really no rating, and they made a mistake, and they didn't trademark it. Now, X can mean a lot of things, really. It can mean in math, variable or unknown, right? In engineering, X is usually experimental. In Roman numerals, it's Roman numeral 10. You had to be 10 years old to get into the Colosseum or the circus to see what was going on. The Roman circus with the tigers and all that kind of stuff. So X had multiple meanings, and in this case, it just meant no rating. It wasn't rated, and as I said, it wasn't trademarked, and so the adult film industry decided that they were going to start doing triple X. Okay, so interestingly, Europe has more restrictions for violence, and other countries, they don't have necessarily PG-13. It might be 15, it might be 16, whatever, depending. France, England, Germany, Japan, right? Every country has their own ratings systems and things like that. But as a cultural difference, they tend to restrict violence more, and we tend to restrict sex more. A pair of naked breasts, something like that, on a woman is more likely to get a higher rating. In Europe, they even have topless beaches and things like that. So culturally, it's a little interesting that we seem to be a little bit more squeamish when it comes to sex, and they certainly restrict violence a little bit more. In the meantime, the adult film industry, they start running rampant with the X rating. And since it's not trademarked, it's co-opted by the adult film industry, and there was really a lot of curiosity about adult films, as they call porn, right? And it's all over the internet, but for a while, it was kind of a curiosity. If you think about it, there was no way for most people to see porn back then. There was no internet and no VHS tapes to find or anything like that. Magazines, okay, nothing like that. There's no way to see it. People had heard about it, and there had been sort of secret movies made, Super 8 movies and stuff that you could, if you knew somebody who knew somebody, you could maybe get a porn movie to show at a bachelor party or something like that. But for the most part, most people had never seen that stuff, and they were kind of curious about it. It's almost like VR or something, right? People have heard of virtual reality. Most people have never actually seen virtual reality. People are kind of curious about things that they've heard about that they haven't seen. I know it sounds funny to say that, but there were big lines around the block to see porn movies for a short period, for a year or two. And movies like Deep Throat made lots and lots of money at the box office in movie theaters, right? In regular old movie theaters. There were even chains of adult movie theaters, Pussycat movie theaters and Mitchell Brother movie theaters, right in Orange County, right in Santa Ana, right around. These kinds of movies were out there. This is one of the more notorious ones, Deep Throat. And strangely, when we get up to All the President's Men, the man that was on the inside giving information to the Washington Post reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, they dubbed him Deep Throat. So it's kind of an inside joke, but most of my students wouldn't get that reference, Deep Throat. But that was the name of a rather notorious and high earning porn film. One of the top 10 films of the year, I think, in '73 or '74. So also, on that same topic, I guess you might say, Midnight Cowboy from 1969 is the only X-rated movie to win a Best Picture Oscar. Right? It actually won a Best Picture Oscar, 1969, and there's Dustin Hoffman, Benjamin from The Graduate, and now we're 2 years later. He's in this movie. Now, what makes it X-rated? Well, it's not porn. X-rated just means that it's stuff for adults, and so there's drugs, there's a little bit of violence, there's homosexuality, okay, and it was just deemed a little bit too adult for kids. And when I go to the movies sometimes, if I see an R-rated movie like a Quentin Tarantino movie, because R-rated movies mean no one, unless they have a parent or adult guardian, I will see, and maybe some of you also, I see parents in there, maybe they couldn't find a babysitter, and they're watching Quentin Tarantino movie or some other violent movie with little 6 and 7-year-old kids in there. Not with their 16-year-old kids, but with little kids. And that's because they can, right? R-rated just means if your parent wants to take anybody to see any of their children to see an R-rated movie, they can. But no one with an X-rated movie or its successor, the NC-17 rated movie, no one is allowed to see it if they're under 17. So even bad parents, I guess you could say, I feel comfortable calling them bad parents, who take their little kids, not their 16-year-old kids, but take their little kids in to see R-rated movies, they can't do that with X-rated movies or with NC-17 rated movies. So that was the thing. And there were a number of other movies that were nominated for Oscars. Originally, Clockwork Orange was rated X. I think it's been re-rated R, but originally Clockwork Orange. Also The Wild Bunch for its violence, and there were a number of other movies that were rated X in the early going, 69, 70, 71, 72, before the adult film industry sort of made the whole X rating a joke. (1969), diving in to also transitioning into the new Hollywood, we have Easy Rider, directed by and starring Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda. This is Peter Fonda here, and Jack Nicholson in a real star-making performance. And this movie it was kind of similar to other kinds of Roger Corman movies. There were motorcycle movies out there, but this one seemed to just have it all. It had a nice theme, a little bit more of an adult theme. A man went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere. There it is, right there on the poster. And they had long hair. They smoked pot. They weren't hippies, really. They weren't hippies. They were motorcycle riders. But they had a great soundtrack, what today you'd call a classic rock soundtrack. Steppenwolf, Jimi Hendrix, the band, uh, uh, acts like that. And that fantastic theme song, Born to Be Wild, played right at the beginning of the movie. And it was nicely done. Good cinematography, nicely edited, well acted, the whole bit. It wasn't some cheesy black and white quickie to show in the drive-ins. But of course, the studios had trouble with it. They couldn't quite figure out exactly what kind of a movie it was. And they put it in the drive-ins, but it made money, and it made more money, and really surprised a lot of people. That it had a theme that not just young people, but especially young people, could really identify with, this spiritual quest, the freedom of the open road, and so on. And really a star turn from Jack Nicholson. He had been around Hollywood for 10 years or so, since the late 50s. He was a little bit older. He was in his 30s by this point, and he was having a hard time getting his acting career out of first gear. He had done a little bit of directing for Roger Corman and some writing. He might have just transitioned into a director or something like that. But his turn, he's only on screen for maybe 15 minutes, maybe 15 or 20 minutes in this whole film, but it just made him an instant star. He kind of eclipsed Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda, really, in that little bit of time that he was on screen, and really made him a star. And Jack Nicholson had a really good decade of the 70s and into the 80s. And we will see a few more Jack Nicholson films, including Chinatown and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and so on, and some other ones, The Last Detail, what else? Five Easy Pieces. So Jack had a pretty good decade. I wanted to highlight his part in the movie, and I usually show, and I've got a link to a scene with them sitting around a campfire, getting stoned, and Jack really is magnetic. He really is. So again, destined for the drive-in. It became a huge hit. Studios really had to take notice, and if you can make a movie for just a very low budget, even adjusting for inflation, it couldn't have cost more than $10 million or something like that in today's money, which is way, way, way below average. Average has to be up around $40–50 million today, not counting these $250 and $300 million Avenger movies and James Bond movies and Harry Potter movies and all that sort of thing. So it made a lot of money. I don't know how much it made adjusting for inflation, but maybe 100 million, something like that, on a very low budget. And the studios start thinking, wow, why do we have to spend all this money on these big bloated movies that they had been doing in the 1960s and 1970s? And there were a lot of big, bloated, expensive flops, and really hurting Hollywood. They had to sell off some of their property, some of their studio acreage, and that sort of thing. And here come these kind of low-budget movies. Even The Graduate didn't cost a whole lot of money, or Bonnie and Clyde. So here are these kind of low-budget movies, these rock and roll generation, a lot of them from film schools and stuff, and the studios really had to sit up and take notice. William Friedkin, not a film school guy, but he was directing documentaries and that sort of thing. And he came out of the gate with The French Connection. It won the Best Picture and the Director Oscars. And he was allowed to make a genre film. And so this kind of harkens back to Alfred Hitchcock thinking to himself, I'm a good director and I'm going to make a genre movie, a slasher movie. And later on, even Stanley Kubrick with 2001, sci-fi, not really thought of very highly. And so all three of these directors, Hitchcock and Friedkin and Kubrick, are going to take on a genre that a lot of people would think is kind of schlocky, drive-in stuff. And so he's going to do it on a big budget with nice special effects and a real A movie. And it makes a ton of money. And for a while, just about every summer or so, the next movie broke the box office records. So The Godfather broke the box office records of The Sound of Music, and then The Exorcist broke the Godfather record, and then Jaws broke the Exorcist, and then Star Wars. So it seemed like there was an era of movies just knocking off the previous champ, one right after another. And we will get into all that. We'll get into Jaws. We'll get into The Godfather. All that is coming up. And we will see more of Martin Scorsese, but this is when he gets his start in the 1970s. We will dive much deeper into Scorsese with Raging Bull, about the boxer, with Robert De Niro, and Goodfellas, and all the Casino, and all the wonderful movies he's going to make. But he started off in this 1970s New Hollywood period, definitely part of the film school generation. He went to New York University. He even taught there for a little while. And there he is on the streets of New York with Robert De Niro, making, I assume, Taxi Driver. That's the way he looked in Taxi Driver. I don't think it's Mean Streets. I'm pretty sure it's Taxi Driver. And so they have paired up over the years and made a number of movies together. We will dive deeper into the Scorsese-De Niro pairing. And then, of course, later on, Scorsese pairs up with Leonardo DiCaprio for 4 or 5 movies as well. So we will talk about that pairing. There are a lot of good director-actor pairings. We've talked about some of them, even with Fellini and Mastroianni, and Kurosawa, and Toshiro Mifune. And I'm doing this off the top of my head. I don't have notes. Let me see here. And Tim Burton and Johnny Depp. So we have a number of director-actor pairings, and this has been one of the more fruitful ones, that's for sure. I love this picture. They look so young. They look just great. Okay, so that's it for today. Wonderful start to the new Hollywood. And after this, like I said, lots of fantastic movies from the 1970s, and we will spend the next class, and I think part of the next one after that, with some wonderful 1970s movies. Boy, we still have to talk about The Godfather and Clockwork Orange and One Flew the Cuckoo's Nest, all sorts of wonderful movies, Chinatown, coming up in the classes ahead. And so for now, this is your professor, Dave Eccles, signing off, and we'll be back next time.